Most families never ask what it is. Tonight, 6 true disturbing stories about the moment a new house stopped feeling safe. The people are real. The names have been changed. The fear has not. This is MrDeadSilence. Story 1. The crooked farmhouse. Mark Delaney backed the U-Haul down the gravel drive and killed the engine. The farmhouse sat at the end of a half-mile lane outside Livingston, Montana, white paint peeling off the siding like old skin. Behind it, the Absaroka Range cut a jagged line against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. "It's crooked," said his daughter Ruby, 8 years old, nose pressed to the window. "It's charming," Mark said. "The listing called it charming." Elena Delaney climbed out of the passenger seat and stood looking up at the second-floor windows for a long moment before she smiled and said it was perfect. 3 bedrooms, 40 acres, a barn they could turn into Mark's wood shop. After 11 years in a Bozeman apartment stacked on top of a dental office, it felt like winning something. They'd bought it from a bank. Foreclosure. The realtor had mentioned that fact the way people mention weather, quick and forgettable. By sundown, and Ruby had already claimed the room with the slanted ceiling. Mark carried the last box up from the truck and found Elena standing very still in the hallway, looking at a spot on the wallpaper near the attic door. "What is it?" "Nothing?" She peeled a strip of paper back with one fingernail. Underneath, someone had written a column of tally marks in pencil, dozens of them, running floor to waist height. "Kid stuff, probably." Mark didn't look long enough to count them. The next morning, an old man in a canvas coat was standing at the end of their driveway when Mark went out for the newspaper box. He didn't come closer. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching the house. "Morning," Mark called. "You buy this place?" "Closed on it Tuesday." The old man nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he already suspected. "Bank never should have listed it again, not after the Hollis family." He said the name like it left a bad taste. "You want my advice? You keep that girl of yours close to the house after dark. Don't let her wander toward the tree line." Then he turned and walked back down the county road without another word. And Mark stood there holding the newspaper, feeling the cold settle somewhere it hadn't been a minute ago. He didn't mention it to Elena. Not that night, not the next. Unpacking swallowed the first week. Boxes became shelves, shelves became a kitchen, and the crooked farmhouse slowly turned into something that resembled a home. Ruby found a barn cat and named her Waffles. Elena hung curtains. Mark told himself the old man was just a lonely local who liked scaring the new people, a small-town tradition older than the county itself. Then the noises started. Not every night. Just enough nights that Mark began keeping a mental tally, the way you count something you're afraid to admit you're counting. A dragging sound in the walls between 2 and 3 in the morning, slow, deliberate, stopping the second he sat up in bed. Once, footsteps on the stairs when both of them were already downstairs. Once, the unmistakable creak of the attic hatch, though when Mark checked it, the padlock was still through the latch, still locked, cold to the touch. Old houses said it, and she believed it, because believing it let her sleep. Mark wanted to believe it too. He spent a Saturday afternoon in the crawl space with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, checking the old joists for movement, checking the foundation for the kind of hairline cracks that might explain a dragging sound at 2 in the morning. He found nothing. No settling, no shifting, no rodents nesting in the insulation, just cold dirt and cobwebs, and, in one corner, a child's plastic barrette, pink and faded, half buried in the dust like it had been waiting there a long time for someone to notice it. He put it in his pocket and didn't tell Elena that either. The following week, he'd mounted on the barn to keep an eye on coyotes, caught something he watched 4 times before he was sure of what he was seeing. 2:14 in the morning, time-stamped in the corner of the frame. The camera's infrared caught the shape of a small figure standing at the edge of the tree line, facing the house, perfectly still, for 11 full minutes before the recording cut out. It was too far from the lens to make out a face. It was close enough that Mark recognized the outline of a child, not an adult, not an animal. A child standing barefoot in October grass at 2 in the morning. When he drove out to the tree line the next day to look for footprints, the frost hadn't melted anywhere near where the figure had stood. Ruby stopped believing at first. She started leaving her bedroom door open at night, a strip of hallway light falling across her floor like a tripwire. When Mark asked why, she said Waffles didn't like the attic anymore. The cat wouldn't go near the hallway after dark, wouldn't eat if her bowl sat too close to the attic door, and one night she vanished for 6 hours and came back with a torn ear and dried blood matted into her fur. 3 weeks in, Mark drove to the county records office in Livingston and asked for the deed history on the property. telling himself it was just curiosity, the kind any new homeowner might have. It wasn't just curiosity. The Hollis family had bought the farmhouse 14 years earlier. 2 adults, 1 daughter, age 9. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, hesitated before pulling the file, and hesitated again before sliding it across the counter. The Hollis girl went of that year. Search parties combed the tree line behind the property for 3 weeks. She was never found. 6 months later, her father was dead by his own hand in the barn, and her mother left the state and never came back to claim the house. The bank took it. Nobody had lived in it since, until now, 14 years of empty rooms and a padlocked attic and tally marks under the wallpaper that Mark had been too afraid to count. "You knew the Hollis?" asked the clerk, before he could stop himself. She took her glasses off and folded them slowly. "Everybody in this county knew the Hollis family, mister. Small towns don't forget the ones that don't come home." She looked at him a long moment, the kind of look that weighed how much a stranger deserved to hear. "There was talk back then, about the father, about things folks noticed and didn't say anything about until it was too late to matter. But talk's all it ever was. Nothing was ever proved. Man's dead now. Can't ask him." Mark drove home with the file photocopies on the passenger seat. The Hollis girl's school portrait paperclip to the top page. A gap-toothed 9-year-old in a purple sweater, smiling the particular unguarded smile of a kid who has no idea yet what the world is capable of. He kept glancing at it at red lights the whole way back, unable to stop, unable to explain why. He didn't tell Elena that night either. He told himself he would once he understood it better, once he had something more than an old file and a bad feeling. That was the lie he told himself to justify saying nothing, and it was the same lie that let 3 more nights pass before everything changed. The dragging sound came back on the 4th night, except this time it didn't stop when Mark sat up. It moved, slow, patient, tracing a path from the attic hatch down the hallway wall, pausing directly outside Ruby's door. Mark was in the hallway before he decided to move, flashlight in one hand, the other already reaching for Ruby's door. It swung open before he touched it. Ruby was standing in the doorway, wide awake, staring past him at the attic hatch. "She wants to come in," Ruby whispered. "She's cold outside." "Who does, baby?" Ruby didn't. She just pointed, one small finger aimed at the attic hatch, where the padlock Mark had checked a dozen times now hung open. The shackle sprung, swinging very slightly, though there was no draft in the house to move it. Mark sent Elena and Ruby down to the truck. He told them to lock the doors and wait, and if he wasn't out in 10 minutes, to drive to the sheriff's substation in town, and he tried to say it calmly enough that Ruby wouldn't hear the truth underneath it. Elena grabbed his wrist at the top of the stairs. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "Don't go up there. Call someone. Call anyone." Mark told her there wasn't time, that whatever was happening right now, and that was the truest thing he'd said to her in 3 weeks. Then he climbed the attic stairs alone, flashlight shaking just slightly in a hand that had never shaken before in his life. The attic was smaller than the footprint of the house below it, the way old attics often are, sloped rafters low enough to force a crouch. Insulation had been torn away from one section of flooring near the far wall, exposed down to bare wood, and beneath a loose board, Mark found a girl's shoe, decayed and small, a hair ribbon gone gray with dust, and a second set of tally marks. Hundreds of them, scratched not with pencil but with something sharper, into the underside of the roof beam itself, where no one crouching in a hurry would ever think. Behind him, the attic hatch swung shut, and the sound of the padlock clicking back into place was the loudest thing Mark had ever heard in his life. He didn't panic. He would tell people later that this was the strangest part, that some cold, functional part of his brain simply took over and started solving the problem in front of him instead of the one behind him. He found the old iron fire poker leaning against a rafter, the kind that had probably hung by the farmhouse's original hearth generations before Mark Delaney had ever heard of Livingston, Montana. And he used it to pry the hatch hinges apart from the inside, splintering 14 years of undisturbed wood, until the hatch dropped open and he half climbed, half fell down into the hallway below. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. He found Elena and Ruby exactly where he'd left them, in the idling truck at the end of the driveway, and it was only once they were moving, tires spitting gravel onto the county road, headlights swallowing the dark ahead of them, that Ruby spoke again from the back seat, small and steady. She said thank you for finding her. Neither Mark nor Elena asked what she meant. Some questions, once asked, can't be unasked, and there are things a father would rather carry unanswered for the rest of his life than confirm out loud in front of his daughter. Mark handed over the shoe, the ribbon, and the barrette from his crawl space to a sheriff's deputy the next morning, along with the file photocopies from the records office. And it was the deputy, not Mark, who first said out loud what everyone in the county had apparently suspected for 14 years and never once said to a badge. The father hadn't just lost his daughter. Neighbors 2 farms over remembered a night that same October, headlights moving across the fields well after midnight, the tractor running long after any reasonable hour for tractor work. Nobody had connected it to anything at the time. Grief does strange things to a man, people said, and left it there, because it was easier than the alternative. The sheriff's department dogs out to the property 4 days later and excavated beneath the barn's dirt floor, following a tip that named the farmhouse's previous owner and a section of ground the dogs wouldn't leave alone no matter how many times the handler called them off it. They found what was left of the Hollis girl 11 feet down, wrapped in a horse blanket that still bore the family's initials stitched into one corner, exactly 11 feet from where Mark had once planned to build his woodshop. The Delaney's never crooked farmhouse. They broke the lease on their old Bozeman apartment a second time and moved back inside a month. And if you drive past the property today, you'll find the for sale sign has been there so long the paint has started to peel, same as the siding once did, same as it probably always will, waiting for the next family who thinks 40 acres and a wood shop sound like winning something. Waffles the buck's worth refused to go back for her food bowl. Somebody had to drive out and get it for her. Story 2, the 3rd bedroom. Sarah Kessler noticed the price first. $210,000 for a 4-bedroom craftsman on 2 acres outside Elkhorn, Oregon, a town so small it didn't have its own zip code, just borrowed one from the county seat 40 minutes east. Her boyfriend Danny Reyes noticed it second and asked the obvious question at the open house. "Why is it so cheap?" The listing agent, a heavyset man named Pruitt who kept checking his phone, said something about structural quirks and an outdated addition without quite meeting Danny's eyes. The house had been built in the 1920s by a logging foreman and expanded twice since, once in the 60s and once, badly, sometime in the 90s, leaving a jigsaw of mismatched hallways and a 4th bedroom that didn't appear on the original blueprints at all. Sarah loved it, and the wraparound porch and the 2 acres of second-growth timber pressing up close behind the house, close enough that deer wandered the yard some mornings, close enough that at night the tree line looked less like a boundary and more like a wall with its own kind of depth to it. They closed in September, moved their 2-door Jeep Wrangler and a rented box truck up the gravel drive on a Saturday, and by nightfall, the house smelled like fresh paint and takeout pizza and felt, for the first time in either of their lives, like something that belonged to them. Their dog Otis, a rescue shepherd mix, wouldn't go near the 4th bedroom. "He's just adjusting," Sarah said when Danny pointed it out, and for the first month it was easy to believe her, because everything else about the move felt like adjusting. New town, new commute, new noises in a house that had stood for 100 years and had every right to. The neighbor came by in October with a pie and a warning wrapped inside pleasant conversation, the way small towns tend to deliver both at once. "You folks the ones who bought the old renter place?" She was maybe 70. Sharp-eyed, introduced herself as Carol from the Blue House down the road. "Good for you. Nobody's touched that house in 3 years. Not since—" She stopped herself, smiled too quickly, and changed the subject to the weather. Danny asked her. Carol hesitated, glancing once toward the tree line behind the house before she answered, then said the previous owner, a contractor named Wade Renner who'd built half the additions on the house himself over 30 years, had simply stopped coming into town one day. No moving truck, no goodbye, no funeral. His truck stayed parked in the drive for 6 months until the bank finally towed it. People assumed he'd moved to be near his sister in Medford. Nobody had ever confirmed it. "Man built this whole house with his own 2 hands, Carol said, looking past them at the porch like she could still see him on it. Knew every board in it better than his own name. Strange thing, a man like that just walking away from something he built." Danny thanked her for thinking much more about it, not that week. Then the electric bill came. It was nearly triple what the listing agent had quoted, triple what a house this size in this county had any business running. And when Danny called the utility company to ask if there'd been a billing error, the woman on the phone pulled up the account and told him, almost apologetically, that usage had actually been high and steady for the past 3 years, even during the 18 months the house had sat unsold and supposedly empty. "Somebody's been running something in there this whole time," she said. Furnace, maybe. Space heater on a timer. Happens more than you'd think with vacant properties. Danny didn't sleep well that night, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Small things started disappearing. A box of granola bars from the pantry, half a sleeve of crackers. A flashlight Danny kept by the back door vanished for 4 days and reappeared in the exact same spot, batteries drained to nothing, like it had simply run itself dry somewhere out of sight. Sarah blamed mice, then raccoons, then, once, in a joke that landed wrong in the quiet kitchen, a ghost. Neither of them laughed. Otis started sleeping outside the 4th bedroom door every night instead of at the foot of their bed, hackles up, growling low at something neither of them could hear. Sarah started noticing things too, the kind of small wrongnesses that are easy to dismiss one at a time, and much harder to dismiss stacked together. A kitchen drawer she was certain she'd left closed, standing open 2 inches. The bathroom mirror fogged in a room nobody had showered in for hours. Once coming home from her shift at the clinic in town, she was sure, not quite sure enough to say out loud, but sure enough to sit in the Jeep in the driveway for a full minute before going inside. She mentioned it to Danny that night, half joking, testing how it would sound out loud. He didn't laugh. He told her, quietly, that he'd started counting the granola bars in the pantry every morning before work, just to see if the number matched what he remembered from the night before. It usually did. Twice, it hadn't. Neither of them said the word they were both thinking. Saying it would have made it real, and being wrong about it, they told each other later, felt safer than being right. The bookshelf in the 4th bedroom had always seemed too heavy for the wall it stood against, bolted in place with brackets that looked newer than the rest of the room's trim. Danny only noticed because Otis wouldn't stop scratching at the baseboard behind it, digging at the same 8 inches of wall night after night, until his claws wore the paint down to bare wood. On a Sunday afternoon in November, more out of frustration than curiosity, Danny pulled the bookshelf away from the wall to see what was underneath. There was a door. Not a closet door. A narrow, unmarked panel cut flush into the drywall, hinged so precisely it had been invisible until the shelf that concealed it moved. No handle. Just a recessed finger groove, worn smooth by years of use. Behind it, a passage ran the width of the house. It wasn't a crawl space. It was tall enough to stand in, framed and insulated like any other room, running behind the 4th bedroom, behind the hallway closet, behind the guest bathroom, connecting to a second hidden door Danny found tucked into the linen closet downstairs. Someone had built it, deliberately, expertly, using the same craftsmanship as the rest of the house, and someone had been living in it. A sleeping bag, a camp stove, water jugs, some full, some empty, a stack of paperback novels, and nailed to the wall at eye level, dozens of photographs, printed from a phone, every single one of them taken from somewhere inside this passage, looking out through small gaps drilled between the wall studs into the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom Sarah used every morning. Danny found Sarah's face in 14 of them. Some were recent, Sarah at the bathroom mirror in her clinic scrubs, Sarah asleep on the couch with Otis curled against her feet. Others were older, printed on paper gone soft and curled at the edges, showing rooms furnished differently, strangers Danny had never met going about ordinary evenings in what he now understood was the same house, watched by the same eyes, long before he and Sarah had ever seen the listing. Whoever had built this passage hadn't started watching in September. He'd been doing this for years, through however many families had lived here, and left without ever knowing why the house never quite... He called the sheriff's department with his hands shaking so badly he had to set the phone on the counter to dial. The dispatcher told them to leave the house immediately and wait outside, and Danny didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Sarah, grabbed Otis by the collar, and they were halfway to the Jeep when the porch light, which neither of them had touched, clicked off, plunging the yard into a dark thick enough to swallow the tree line whole. Somewhere behind them, in the direction of the house, a door they hadn't opened creaked shut. Sarah would say later that she didn't scream, didn't even feel afraid in that exact moment, only a kind of total animal clarity that told her legs to move before her mind had finished processing why. Otis didn't need convincing. He was already straining against his collar, dragging Danny the last 10 feet to the Jeep. They didn't wait for the sheriff in the yard. They ran for the Jeep, and Danny would say later that the 2 minutes it took to get the engine turned over were the longest 2 minutes of his life. Headlights sweeping across the porch, the windows, the tree line, catching nothing, and then, for less than a second, catching the shape of a man standing at the corner of the house, watching them, before he stepped back into the dark between the trees and was gone. Deputies arrived 9 minutes later, guns drawn, moving through the house room by room while Sarah and Danny waited in the back of a patrol car with the doors locked and Otis pressed shaking between them. The lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man named Osei, who'd grown up 2 towns over, came out to the car twice, first to tell them the house was clear, and second, 20 minutes later, considerably less steady than the first time, to ask Danny exactly how far back into the timber the property line ran. They searched the passage, the surrounding 2 acres, and the tree line until well past midnight, finding a second, smaller shelter dug into the hillside a quarter-mile back in the timber, stocked with enough canned food, propane, and clean water to suggest someone had been living on the property, on and off, for a very long time, retreating into the woods whenever the house itself grew too risky to occupy. They found no one that night. Wade Renner's fingerprints, pulled from an old building permit on file with the county, matched a partial print lifted from one of the water jugs in the wall passage. He'd built the 4th bedroom's hidden addition himself, 30 years earlier, back when the house was still his, and the passage was framed as nothing more sinister than extra storage. When he lost the house to foreclosure, according to the sheriff's best reconstruction, he simply never left it. He'd watched 3 different showings from inside those walls. He'd watched Sarah and Danny move their furniture in, unpack their kitchen, choose the 4th bedroom as a home office, all from a gap between the studs 18 inches from where they slept. Wade Renner was found 11 days later, 8 miles up a logging road, living out of a hunting cabin that didn't belong to him either. He didn't resist when they took him in. According to the deputy who booked him, the only thing he said the entire ride to the county jail was that he'd built that house with his own 2 hands, and no bank, no listing agent, and no new family had any right to tell him he didn't belong in it anymore. Investigators later connected Renner to 2 other properties in the county where he'd done contracting work decades earlier, both homes he'd added onto, both featuring additions with wall cavities wider than any building code required. One family who'd lived in a Renner-built house outside nearby Trask Valley for 6 years, raising 2 kids in it, contacted the sheriff's department after the story broke, saying they'd always assumed the strange sounds in their walls were squirrels. Nobody had ever checked. Nobody had ever thought to. Sarah and Danny were at a loss, to a flipping company that gutted the 4th bedroom, the hidden passage, and the hillside shelter before anyone else ever had to find out what it felt like to be watched through the walls of their own home. Carol from the Blue House still brings pie to whoever moves in next. She still doesn't finish the sentence about why the price is so low. Otis, for what it's worth, has never once slept facing a wall again. Even in their new place, a rental on the other side of town with no 4th bedroom and no hidden passages behind any of its bookshelves, he still chooses the spot by the front door every night, back to the wall, eyes on the room, watching the way he never used to before Elkhorn. Sarah says she doesn't blame him. Some habits, once a house teaches them to you, don't leave when you do. Story 3. Chris Bauer and Mia Foster moved into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision outside Boise, Idaho, 3 weeks before their daughter was born, into a house that had never been lived in by anyone before them. New construction, still smelling faintly of drywall dust and fresh carpet glue, every fixture in it gleaming and untouched. The builder had thrown in a full smart home package as a closing incentive: keyless entry, app-controlled thermostat, a video doorbell, security cameras bolted above the garage and the back patio. All of it tied into a single app on Mia's phone that promised to put the whole house in the palm of her hand. For the first 6 weeks, that felt like a small miracle. Mia could unlock the front door for her mother from the hospital bed while she was still recovering, could check the nursery camera between feedings without getting up, could adjust the thermostat from her phone at 3 a.m. without waking Chris to do it. The house did exactly what it was supposed to do, quietly, invisibly, the way good technology is meant to disappear into the background of a life. It made new parenthood, which was already the hardest thing either of them had ever done, feel a little less impossible. The first strange day in late February, Mia woke to feed the baby and found the living room thermostat had been set to 62 degrees overnight, a full 10 degrees below where she'd left it, cold enough that her breath nearly fogged in the hallway on her way to the nursery. She adjusted it back, chalked it up to a setting she'd fat-fingered half asleep the night before, and didn't think about it again until it happened twice more that week, always overnight, always while the baby monitor showed nothing but a still, dark room. Chris found the porch light, wired into the smart system along with everything else, had started turning on and off in a slow, deliberate rhythm around 2 a.m, 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off, running for exactly 11 minutes each time before stopping on its own, as though whoever controlled it were testing something, timing something, learning the exact edges of what the house would let them do without anyone noticing. He checked the app's automation settings twice and found nothing scheduled, no rule that would explain it, no glitch the manufacturer's support line could reproduce when he called them. Probably a firmware bug, the support technician told him in the bored voice of someone who fielded 50 calls like this a week and had long since stopped being curious about any of them. New builds run into this all the time. Give it a firmware update and it usually sorts itself out. They updated the firmware. The porch light kept its rhythm anyway. A week later, the baby monitor's speaker crackled to life at 4 a.m. with a burst of static followed by 3 seconds of what Mia swore when she described it to Chris the next morning sounded like breathing, slow and deliberate, close to the microphone. Chris checked the monitor's settings and found the volume had been raised to maximum from somewhere other than either of their phones. He told Mia it was probably interference from a neighbor's baby monitor bleeding onto the same frequency. A common enough problem in a subdivision this dense with matching new construction wiring. And for a few days she let herself believe him, because the alternative meant admitting something she wasn't ready to say out loud in a house they'd just spent their savings on. "It's a new house," Chris said more than once that week, the way people say things they need to be true. "Things get worked out. That's what new houses do." 3 weeks after the baby came home, Mia's mother stopped by unannounced on a Thursday afternoon and mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd tried the front door app to let herself in the week before, the same way Mia had shown her, and found it already unlocked, though nobody had been home. Mia hadn't unlocked it. Chris had been at work. The access log in the app, when Mia finally thought to check it, showed the door unlocking itself at 11:47 that morning, attributed simply to system, with no username, no device, nothing the app support team could explain beyond a shrug and a suggestion to change the account password, which Mia did immediately, hands cold, glancing at the baby monitor on the counter the entire time she typed. The nursery camera turned to face the wall on a Sunday night while Mia and Chris were eating dinner 2 rooms away. Not knocked over, not malfunctioning. The footage, when Chris pulled it up afterwards, showed the camera's motor rotating smoothly, deliberately, 90 degrees over the course of 4 seconds, panning away from the crib and coming to rest facing blank drywall, the exact motion the camera was designed to make when someone with access used the app's manual controls to move it. Mia watched the clip 6 times in a row, standing in the kitchen with her dinner going cold, before she finally said the word neither of them had let themselves say yet. "Someone's in the house." Not a bug. Someone. Chris called the security company that installed the system the next morning and asked, point blank, who besides himself and Mia had access to their account. The woman on the phone put him on hold for 6 minutes. Elevator music looped twice before she came back, and when she did, her voice had changed, careful in a way it hadn't been before, the practiced calm of someone reading from a script she'd clearly been handed for exactly this kind of call. "Can I ask what prompted this question, Mr. Bauer?" Chris told her about the thermostat, the porch light, the door, the camera turning itself to face a blank wall. He heard her stop typing. She told him the system had been installed by a subcontracted technician named Roy Whitfield, and that Whitfield's employment with the company had been terminated 4 months earlier, after 2 other homeowners in 2 other new-build subdivisions filed complaints alleging he'd retained remote access to smart home systems he'd personally installed, using it to unlock doors and reposition cameras in homes he no longer had any professional reason to enter. "We were supposed to have purged all his access credentials in March," she said. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Bauer. I don't actually know if that happened for every property he touched. I need to escalate this to our security team today. Please don't wait on us. Call the police." Chris asked how many homes Whitfield had installed systems in before he was fired. There was a long pause on the line before she answered, the sound of someone pulling up a spreadsheet they clearly wished they didn't have to read from. The answer, when the company finally produced it 2 days later under pressure from a lawyer Chris hired that same afternoon, was 31. Spread across 4 subdivisions in the Boise area, including the one Chris and Mia now lived in. That night, Chris didn't sleep. He sat in the nursery with the baby monitor's video feed pulled up on his laptop, watching an empty crib and a static hallway, jumping every time the refrigerator compressor kicked on downstairs, every time a car passed on the street outside, every small ordinary sound of a house behaving like a house, instead of something with a stranger's hand still resting somewhere inside it. It was somewhere around 1 a.m. that the porch camera feed, displayed in a second window, showed a man standing at the edge of their driveway, motionless, facing the house, For almost 4 full minutes, he wore a dark jacket with the hood down despite the cold. And he didn't check his phone, didn't shift his weight from foot to foot, didn't do any of the small restless things a person does while waiting for something. He simply watched, the way a person watches something they already know intimately, before turning and walking away into the dark between 2 unfinished lots across the street. Chris called the police immediately, his voice low so it wouldn't carry through the monitor into the nursery where Mia was finally, mercifully asleep. By the time a patrol car reached Meadowbrook Estates, the driveway was empty. The porch light had gone dark on its own schedule, and the only evidence anyone had been there at all was a single boot print in the mud along the property line, half erased by a light rain that had started an hour earlier. The department assigned a detective the next day, a soft-spoken woman named Alvarez, who spent 2 hours going through the access logs Chris had saved, cross-referencing timestamps against Whitfield's last known cell tower pings, which the department's tech unit was able to pull with a warrant by the end of the week. She asked Chris and Mia dozens of small questions that felt irrelevant at the time, and turned out not to be: what nights Chris worked late, what days Mia took the baby to her mother's, which windows in the house didn't have curtains yet. It became clear, listening to the pattern in her questions, that whoever had been watching the house already knew most of the answers. The pattern that emerged from the logs unsettled even Alvarez, 22 years on the job. Whitfield hadn't just been watching the Bauer house. He'd been cycling through a rotating list of properties he'd installed systems in, spending a few nights monitoring one, then moving to the next, then the next, an unhurried, patient circuit through 31 homes full of families who had no idea a stranger held a working key to their front door. Alvarez recommended Chris and Mia leave the house that night and stay somewhere off the smart systems network entirely, at least until officers could physically locate Whitfield. They packed the baby's things into the truck bed of Chris's pickup in under 20 minutes, moving fast and quiet the way you move when a stranger with a key to your front door might be within earshot, and drove to a motel off the interstate. Mia held the baby against her chest the whole way, watching the side mirror for headlights that never quite matched the pattern of ordinary traffic, and it was there at 3 a.m. in a motel room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner that Mia's phone lit up with a push notification from the app neither of them had thought to. Front door unlocked. System. Neither of them slept the rest of that night. Chris sat by the window with the curtain pulled back an inch, watching the parking lot, while Mia rocked the baby in a chair that didn't rock and refused to put her down even after she'd fallen asleep. Officers picked Whitfield up 2 days later at an extended stay motel 11 miles from Meadowbrook, where they found a laptop with live remote access still open to 4 different homeowners' camera systems, including the Bauer house, and a spiral notebook filled with handwritten notes on residents' routines, work schedules, and the exact nights certain families would be away. Detective Alvarez told Chris afterward that the notebook read less like surveillance and more like a diary, entries written in the first person, describing the families as though Whitfield believed himself entitled to a place in their lives simply because his hands had wired the walls around them. Whitfield pleaded 2 counts of unauthorized computer access, and the security company, facing a lawsuit from all 31 affected households, paid to have every system in Meadowbrook Estates torn out and replaced under new credentials that Whitfield had never touched. The company also agreed, as part of a settlement Chris's lawyer negotiated, to fund an independent audit of every subdivision any of their subcontractors had ever installed systems in, a process that was still ongoing 8 months later and had already turned up 2 more homes with lingering unauthorized access from a different, unrelated technician entirely. Chris and Mia kept the house. They kept the smart locks eventually, though it took Mia the better part of a year before she stopped checking the app's access log every night before bed, scrolling back through days of nothing, just to be sure it still said nothing. She started keeping a spare mechanical deadbolt key in her nightstand drawer too, something with no app, no password, no login for a stranger to quietly retain, and she told Chris more than once that the click of that old-fashioned bolt sliding home was the only lock in the entire house that ever actually let her sleep. The porch light, for what it's worth, has never once run its strange 3-second rhythm again. But Mia still catches herself glancing at it sometimes, out the kitchen window, long after the baby's asleep, waiting to see if it will. Story 4. Grant and Paige Whitmore bought the old Pruitt Ranch outside Cutbank Ridge, Wyoming, sight unseen, except for photographs, because Grant's job with a regional power cooperative had transferred him 3 states over, and there hadn't been time for a proper house hunting trip. 40 acres, a renovated bunkhouse, and a 100-year-old farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a view of the bighorns that made the real estate photos look almost unfair. The price had been low enough that their realtor mentioned it twice, apologetically the way people mention a used car's mileage, offering half-hearted explanations about a soft rural market and buyer hesitancy over the property's remote septic and well systems. Grant chalked it up to the remote location, the 2-hour drive to the nearest hospital, the kind of practical inconvenience that scares off buyers with more money than patience. He and Paige had neither the money nor the patience to be scared off by much of anything by that point. They moved in on a Friday in April, hauling their belongings the last 140 miles behind Grant's truck in a rented gooseneck trailer, arriving as the sun was dropping behind the mountains and turning the ranch's dirt yard the color of rust. Paige fell in love with the place before the trailer was even unhitched, walking the porch boards in her socks, already planning where she'd hang the wind chimes her mother had given her as a housewarming gift. Grant fell in love with the old cast-iron wood stove in the kitchen, still working, still warm from decades of Wyoming winters it had outlasted. The previous owner, a man named Earl Pruitt, had lived alone on the property for nearly 30 years, according to the county records Grant pulled up out of simple curiosity while they were still in escrow. Pruitt had built most of the ranch's additions himself, including a reinforced root cellar behind the bunkhouse that the listing described only as a storm shelter, standard enough for tornado country that Grant hadn't thought twice about it. Pruitt himself had stopped paying his property taxes 4 years earlier, and the bank had eventually foreclosed, though no death certificate had ever been filed, no obituary, no forwarding address. He had simply, at some point, stopped being anywhere anyone could find him, and the county had quietly repossessed a ranch that technically still belonged to a man nobody could locate to sign it over. A neighbor named Dale Overby, who ran cattle on the section adjoining the Whitmore's property, drove over that first week with a case of local beer and a warning delivered with the easy, unhurried cadence of a man who'd lived his whole life within 20 miles of where he was standing. Earl was a strange one, even by ranch country standards, Dale said, leaning against his truck bed while Grant unloaded fence posts. Real deep into the prepper thing. Bunkers, generators, food stores enough to outlast the apocalypse twice over. Kept mostly to himself the last 10 years or so. Stopped coming into town for anything. Had his groceries delivered out here by a service from Sheridan. Then one day, he just wasn't around anymore, and nobody around here was close enough to him to notice for a good long while. Did he have family who might have checked on him? Paige asked, coming out onto the porch with a glass of tea for their guest. Ex-wife left him a long time before any of this. No kids I ever heard of. Man built himself a life out here that didn't leave much room for anybody to miss him when he stopped showing up. Dale took the tea, nodded his thanks, and looked out toward the bunkhouse for a moment longer than the conversation strictly called for. Grant asked if looking for him. Dale shrugged, the particular Wyoming shrug that means a question has an answer nobody especially wants to say out loud. Sheriff's Department did a welfare check, best I recall. Found the place locked up tight. No sign of trouble, no note. Man's allowed to move on without telling the whole county about it. That's about where it got left. For the first month, the ranch behaved exactly like the peaceful, remote property they'd paid for. Paige started a garden. Grant repaired fence line and got to know the sound the old house made settling at night, distinguishing it over time from sounds that didn't belong. It was the generator that first caught his attention, a heavy-duty diesel unit housed in a shed behind the bunkhouse, wired according to the property survey to run backup power to the root cellar Pruitt had built. Grant had assumed it was decorative, another relic of the man's doomsday habits, until he noticed the fuel gauge dropping steadily over 2 weeks despite the fact that neither he nor Paige had ever switched it on. He mentioned it to Paige over dinner, half joking, the way you joke about things that don't quite sit right yet. She said maybe it had a slow leak, and for a few days that explanation held, right up until Grant found muddy boot prints on the bunkhouse porch one morning that matched neither his own boots nor Paige's, tracking in from the direction of the root cellar and stopping cold at the bunkhouse door as though whoever made them had thought better of going any further. He photographed them before the next rain washed them away, telling himself it was probably Dale checking on a stray calf, though Dale, when Grant asked him about it the following week, said he hadn't set foot on the Whitmore property in over... The dog they'd brought with them from their old place, an aging border collie named Scout, who'd never shown a nervous bone in her body in 8 years, started refusing to walk anywhere near the root cellar mound at all, planting all 4 feet and whining low in her throat anytime Grant tried to lead her past it on their evening walk, until eventually he stopped trying and let her choose their route herself. He wanted to believe that too, right up until the night 3 weeks later when he woke at 2 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately place, a rhythmic, muffled thumping carrying up through the floor of the bunkhouse. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again, patient and deliberate in a way no settling house timber ever managed to sound. Grant was telling himself it was pipes, or the well pump cycling, or some mechanical quirk of a 100-year-old ranch he simply hadn't learned yet. In the morning, he walked out to the root cellar behind the bunkhouse for the first time since they'd moved in, a reinforced steel door set into a mound of earth, padlocked with a heavy brass lock that looked considerably newer than the door itself. He stood there a long moment before deciding, against every instinct telling him this was a problem for daylight and better judgment than his own, to go back to the house for bolt cutters. The lock gave way, the brass shackle popping free with a sound that felt far too loud for the quiet morning around him. Behind the steel door, a set of concrete steps descended into darkness, deeper than any storm shelter had any reason to need. The beam of Grant's flashlight swallowed almost completely after the first 10 feet, the air rising up out of the stairwell carrying a stale, mechanical smell of diesel and something else underneath that he didn't let himself try to name. He called down before he went any further, his voice sounding thin and foolish in the open Wyoming morning, some part of him still hoping for an echo, a settling pipe, anything ordinary enough to send him back inside for coffee and a laugh at his own nerves. It was the response that came back up the stairwell instead, faint, hoarse, unmistakably human, that sent him running back to the house for his phone rather than going any further alone. The sheriff's department reached the ranch in just under 40 minutes, longer than Grant had ever wanted to wait in his life, and it was a deputy named Torres who went down the steps first, flashlight and weapon both drawn, radioing back information in short, clipped bursts that Grant and Page listened to from the yard, with their hands locked together so tightly neither of them could later remember which one had grabbed the other's first. 2 more deputies followed, then a third, the yard filling with the low, static crackle of radio traffic and the particular stillness that settles over people waiting to find out whether something terrible has already happened or is somehow happening. It was nearly 20 as his voice came back up the stairwell, clearly enough for Grant and Page to make out actual words instead of fragments, and what he said sent one of the other deputies sprinting back to his cruiser for the first aid kit before the sentence had even finished. The shelter ran underground, a series of reinforced rooms Pruitt had built over the better part of a decade, stocked with enough food, water, and medical supplies to sustain a person for years, exactly as any prepper's bunker might be expected to look, except for the locked interior door at the very back, and the woman deputies found behind it, alive, severely malnourished, and unable at first to give them anything beyond her first name. Her name was Denise Callahan. She had gone missing from a truck stop outside Gillette, Wyoming, 11 years earlier, a case that had gone cold within 18 months for lack of any evidence at all, filed away in a drawer at a sheriff's department 2 counties over, and largely forgotten by everyone except the family who had never stopped looking. She had been 23 the night she disappeared, driving home from a waitressing shift, and the last confirmed sighting of her had been a gas station camera catching her Honda pulling out onto the highway shortly after midnight, 31 miles from where investigators now stood in Grant and Page's yard, watching home fetch her up out of the ground. Investigating months piecing together what they could of Pruitt's decade with her, working from what little Denise herself was willing or able to say in the early days after her rescue, and from the meticulous, horrifying logs Pruitt had kept in a ledger found in the bunker's front room, tracking supplies, dates, and routines, with the same obsessive discipline he'd apparently once applied to power grid maintenance work he'd left behind decades earlier, under circumstances nobody in Cutbank Ridge had ever thought to question. Pruitt himself was never found. The working theory, based on a partially collapsed side tunnel investigators discovered running from the shelter toward the base of a dry creek bed a quarter mile off, was that he died sometime in the 4 years since he'd stopped paying property taxes. Likely in some accident during ongoing tunnel work, nobody had been around to notice or report, leaving Denise Callahan alive behind a locked door with a generator, a stockpile built to outlast exactly this kind of failure, and no way out that didn't require someone else's hands on the other side of that steel door. Denise spent 4 months in a hospital in Sheridan before being reunited with a family that had held a memorial service for her 9 years earlier, uncertain until the very end whether they were burying an absence or a person. Her mother told a local reporter in one of the only interviews the family ever agreed to give that she'd kept Denise's bedroom exactly as it was the whole 11 years, unable to pack it away, and unable to explain to anyone, including herself, why she'd never been able to stop believing her daughter might still come home. Grant and Paige visited her twice during her recovery, at her request, though neither of them ever quite knew what to say to a woman who thanked them for something as ordinary as noticing a generator's fuel gauge dropping. They sold them at a considerable loss, unable to bring themselves to sleep another season within earshot of ground that had kept a secret like that for over a decade. The bunker itself was filled in with concrete at the county's insistence before the next family ever moved in, a decision nobody on the Cutbank Ridge Planning Board debated for more than the length of a single meeting. Dale Overby still runs cattle on the section next door, same as he always has. He still tells people, when they ask about the old Pruitt place, that Earl was a strange one, even by ranch country standards, though these days he says it a good deal quieter than he used to. And he never quite finishes the sentence the same way twice. Story 5. The quitclaim Josh and Elena Cortez found the house the way most people find the deal of a lifetime, which is to say a deal too good to survive much scrutiny. A 4-bedroom adobe-style home on 3 acres outside Vail Springs, Arizona, 40 minutes from the nearest grocery store, listed at half of what comparable properties in the county were fetching, sold through an online auction site that specialized in distressed and foreclosed properties. The listing agent, working remotely out of Phoenix and communicating almost entirely through email, explained the discount as a quirk of an estate sale gone sideways, an elderly owner who'd moved into assisted living with no surviving family to manage the transaction properly. Josh, who prided himself on reading contracts other people skimmed, went through the paperwork twice and found nothing that raised a flag, checking signature dates against notary stamps, cross-referencing parcel numbers against the county assessor's site, satisfied enough by the second pass that he stopped looking for problems that weren't, on the surface, there to find. Because the kind of fraud built into that paperwork wasn't designed to be caught by a careful reading. It was designed to survive one. They closed in 6 weeks, wired the funds, and drove out from Tucson on a Saturday in a rented moving van packed with everything they owned, arriving at a house that looked, in person, exactly as promising as it had in the photographs. Thick adobe walls that kept the desert heat out even in June, a covered patio facing west toward a sunset that turned the whole property gold every evening, and enough land between them and the nearest neighbor that Elena, who'd grown up in a cramped Tucson duplex, cried a little the first night just looking at the stars. Josh spent that first weekend walking the property line with a printed survey map, half out of pride and half out of the quiet disbelief that any of it was actually theirs. 3 acres of high desert scrub and a house with more square footage than either of them had ever lived in before. The first sign of trouble came 9 days later, in the form of a certified letter from a title insurance company Josh had never worked with, informing him that a claim had been filed disputing the validity of the deed transfer and that he should contact legal counsel immediately. Josh called the number on the letter 3 times before anyone picked up, and what the representative told him took the rest of that day to fully sink in. The quitclaim deed used to transfer the property into the auction seller's name had, according to a complaint filed by an Arizona Adult Protective Services caseworker, been signed under circumstances the caseworker's office considered highly irregular by an 83-year-old woman named Ruth Halstead, who had, at the time of signing, been recently diagnosed with a level of cognitive impairment that made her legal capacity to sign anything at all deeply. In plain terms, the representative said, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who delivered bad news for a living, there's a real possibility the person who sold you this house never had the legal right to sell it in the first place. Josh asked what that meant for them, for the money they'd already wired, for the house they'd already unpacked their entire lives into. The representative told him, gently, that it was too early to say, that these cases sometimes took months or even years to untangle, and that in the meantime he and Elena should keep every piece of documentation they had and expect, eventually, to hear from an attorney representing the true owner's interests. Elena wanted to leave that same week. Josh, still clinging to the idea that a signed contract and a wired payment meant something, insisted they stay while the title company sorted out the legal mess, and for nearly a month, nothing happened to suggest he was wrong. They unpacked, planted a garden that the desert soil mostly rejected, learned the particular quiet of a house with no other lights visible after dark. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late October, a man appeared at the edge of their property line just as the sun was dropping below the ridge, standing motionless at the fence for nearly 10 minutes before Josh worked up the nerve to walk out and ask what he wanted. Their landline, a holdover from the previous listing's phone service that neither of them had bothered to cancel, had gone dead earlier that same afternoon. A fact Josh only noticed because he'd tried calling Elena's cell from it as a test and gotten nothing but silence. The utility company had no record of any outage in the area, and no explanation for why a line that had worked perfectly the day before had simply stopped carrying a signal, and it would be another 2 weeks before either of them connected that afternoon to anything beyond bad luck and old wiring. "This is my mother," the man said, without any greeting first. He gave his name as Curtis Halstead, said he'd been out of the country working an oil contract for the better part of a year, and that he'd come home to find his mother moved into a memory care facility 2 counties away, and her house sold out from under her by a caseworker and a stranger he'd never heard of. "I don't know who you people are," he said, still not raising his voice, still not moving from the fence line. "But you're living in a house that belongs to a woman who can't even remember her own name most days now. I want to know how that happened, and I want it fixed." He didn't come past the fence line. He simply stood there, delivering the facts of his ruined year in a flat, controlled tone that Josh found, if anything, more unsettling than shouting would have been. And then he turned and walked back to a truck parked on the shoulder of the county road and drove away. Josh called the title company the next morning and learned for the first time that Curtis Halstead's name appeared nowhere in any of the paperwork associated with the sale, that the caseworker's complaint had specifically flagged the transaction as potential elder fraud committed by a third party who was neither Ruth Halstead nor any relative of hers, and that the auction seller's contact information, an email address, and a burner phone number that had seemed perfectly ordinary 6 weeks earlier had gone dead the same week the complaint was filed. Whoever had actually sold Josh and Elena the house, it was becoming clear, had never had any right to, and Curtis Halstead, whatever his intentions, at least had a more legitimate claim to the property than anyone else currently involved. Curtis came back for the following 2 weeks, each visit a little closer to the house, a little longer in duration, though he never once set foot past the property line or said anything that crossed clearly into threat. Elena stopped answering the door, watching him instead from behind the kitchen curtain until his truck pulled away each time. Josh started keeping his phone in his pocket at all times, the sheriff's non-emergency line saved as a favorite, and it was somewhere in that stretch of days that he noticed the tool shed padlock had been cut and replaced with a different lock entirely, one neither of them owned a key to, and a gas can that had been 3/4 full was now standing empty by the shed door. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in November. No warning beforehand. No truck parked on the shoulder to give them the 10 minutes notice they'd come to unconsciously rely on. Elena heard the back door handle turning at 11:40 p.m., the deadbolt Josh had installed the week before holding it shut, and by the time Josh reached the kitchen with a flashlight in one hand and his phone already dialing in the other, the handle had stopped moving, and the voice on the other side of the door, unmistakably Curtis's, was speaking low and steady. "I'm not leaving this time. This is my mother's house. You're going to give me the keys or I'm coming through this door whether you're standing behind it or not." "Curtis, the police are already on their way," Josh said, forcing his voice steadier than he felt, phone pressed against his other ear with the dispatcher still on the line. "Nobody has to get hurt tonight. Just wait for them. Talk to them. We're not the ones who did this to your mother." There was a long silence on the other side of the door, long enough that Josh let himself hope it was over before the handle began turning again, slower this time, testing the deadbolt's give the way a man tests ice before committing his full weight to it. Josh got the dispatcher on the line and kept Curtis talking through the door at the same time, some instinct telling him that silence would only speed up whatever came next, while Elena crouched behind the kitchen island with a cast-iron pan in both hands, shaking too hard to be sure she could actually use it if it came to that. Somewhere in the dark backyard, the motion light over the patio clicked on and off twice, catching a shape moving along the side of the house toward the bedroom window, and Josh's stomach dropped as he realized Curtis wasn't only testing the back door anymore. The county sheriff's department, dispatched from a substation 26 minutes away, was the longest 26 minutes either of them had ever lived through, filled with the sound of Curtis testing the door, the window latches, the side gate, methodical and unhurried in a way that felt worse than if he'd simply broken something and rushed in. At one point, the bedroom window latch gave a soft metallic click that neither of them could immediately place, and it was only afterward, once deputies walked the property with flashlights, that they found the screen pried halfway off its track, one determined effort short of coming free entirely. Deputies arrived to find Curtis Halstead sitting on the porch steps in the dark, not fleeing, not hiding, waiting for them with a kind of exhausted resignation that one of the responding deputies later described as more heartbreaking than dangerous, though it hadn't felt that way from inside the house an hour earlier. He didn't resist arrest. He told the deputies the same story he'd told Josh at the fence line weeks before, and it was, as the following months of investigation would confirm, almost entirely true. The auction seller was eventually identified as a man operating under 3 different aliases who had defrauded at least 6 elderly homeowners across 2 states using forged power of attorney documents and quitclaim deeds, a scheme that unraveled once Ruth Halstead's memory care facility flagged inconsistencies in her financial paperwork and alerted Adult Protective Services. Investigators later determined he'd targeted Ruth specifically after finding her name in a public probate notice following her husband's death, a pattern he'd repeated with at least 4 of his other victims, each of them recently widowed, each of them living alone with family members far enough away to make the fraud harder to catch in time. He was arrested in Nevada 4 months later, facing charges in both states, while Josh and Elena spent nearly a year in legal limbo before a judge finally voided the fraudulent transfer and restored the property to Ruth Halstead's estate, leaving Josh and Elena to recover what they could of their money through a title insurance claim that took another 8 months to settle. Curtis Halstead pleaded to a reduced charge of criminal trespass. The burglary charge dropped in light of the fraud investigation that ultimately validated most of what he'd claimed from the very first evening at the fence line. Josh saw him once more, at a restitution hearing neither of them had expected the other to attend, and neither man said much beyond a short, awkward nod that acknowledged, without needing words, how thoroughly they'd both been used by the same stranger neither of them had ever actually met in person. A con man they would each, in their own ways, spend years trying not to think about. Ruth Halstead passed away 11 months after the ordeal began, in the memory care facility she never left, never fully aware of the war fought over the house she'd built with her late husband 40 years earlier. The property sold again the following spring, this time through a conventional listing with a conventional title search, to a retired couple from Flagstaff who have no idea, as far as anyone in Vail Springs is aware, how close 2 other lives once came to unraveling entirely on their new front porch, or how much of the paperwork behind their own quiet, uneventful closing exists precisely because of what happened there the year before. Story 6, New House, Old Blood. The realtor called it a handyman's dream. I called it the first place I'd ever owned that didn't have someone else's name on the lease. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a 1/4 acre of overgrown grass in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Reno, Nevada, where the air smelled like sage and dry heat even in October. I closed on it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had boxes stacked to the ceiling in every room and a mattress on the floor because the bed frame hadn't shipped yet. My name is Danielle Voss. I'm 29. I work remote, doing claims processing for an insurance company, which means I spend 8 hours a day staring at spreadsheets and the other 16 trying to convince myself I made the right decision moving 3 states away from everyone I know, alone, into a house built in 1987 that the inspection report called structurally sound with minor concerns. The minor concern was the smell. It started in the basement. Not sewage, not mold. Something sweeter, almost like rot, but underneath a layer of bleach, like someone had tried to scrub it away and only partly succeeded. I ran a dehumidifier down there for 2 days straight. The smell dulled, but never. The second thing I noticed was the lock on the crawlspace door. Every house has one, that low door in the basement wall that leads into the space under the floor joists, full of insulation and ductwork and spiders you don't want to think about. Mine had a hasp and a padlock on the outside. Not the kind of lock you'd put on a door to keep something out. The kind you'd put on a door to keep something in. I asked my neighbor about it. Her name was Carol, mid-60s, lived 2 houses down with a dog that barked at nothing. She'd lived on the street for 11 years. "The Hendersons owned it before you," she said, standing in her doorway like she didn't want to invite the conversation any further into her house than the porch. Nice family. 2 kids. They moved out kind of sudden, though. Real sudden. Sudden how? Carol's smile didn't reach her eyes. You'd have to ask them. I don't really know the details, just good luck with the place. She shut the door before I could ask anything else. That night I looked up the address. Public records, old news archives, anything I could find. It took almost 2 hours of digging through a local paper's dead link archive before I found a headline from 6 years back. Local family relocates after disturbing discovery. Declines to comment. No further details. No follow-up. Just 1 paragraph, and then nothing. Like the story had been swallowed, I told myself it didn't matter. Old houses have old stories. That's what makes them cheap enough for people like me to afford. I went to bed at 11. I woke up at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of something scraping against wood, slow and deliberate, coming from directly beneath my bedroom floor. I lay there for a long slamming, telling myself it was pipes settling, or the house cooling down, or an animal that had gotten into the crawl space through some gap I hadn't found yet. The scraping stopped. I didn't sleep again until sunrise. The next morning, I went down to the basement with a flashlight and my phone recording, because if I was going to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind, I needed proof one way or another. The padlock on the crawl space door was still locked, still solid. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. Just cold air leaking through the seam. I told myself that settled it. Whatever I'd heard, it wasn't coming from in there. Probably just old ductwork contracting as the temperature dropped. I went back upstairs, made coffee, and tried to work. At 10 a.m., a delivery truck dropped off the last of my furniture. The driver, a big guy in his 50s named Russ, according to his name tag, helped me carry a dresser up the front steps. When we set it down in the hallway, he glanced toward the basement door, which I'd left open. "You bought the Henderson place," he said. Not a question. "You know it?" "Everybody on this route knows it. Delivered here a bunch of times before they left." He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "You should get that crawl space checked out by somebody who knows what they're doing. Not just a home inspector. Somebody who knows the history." "What?" Russ hesitated, the way people do right before they decide whether to tell you something or protect you from it. He chose the second one. "Just get it checked," he said, and left before I could push further. That was the moment I should have called someone, a contractor, an inspector, even just Carol again, to demand a real answer instead of a polite deflection. Instead, I did what anyone with a mortgage and a stubborn streak does. I decided to handle it myself. I found a bolt cutter in the garage, left behind by the previous owners, which in hindsight should have told me something. I went down to the basement that evening, snapped the padlock, and pulled the crawl space door open. The smell hit me first, stronger down there, thick enough to taste. My flashlight beam cut into a space maybe 3 feet high, packed dirt floor, wooden support beams disappearing into darkness in 3 directions, and carved into the beam directly in front of me, at eye level if I'd been crouching lower, someone had scratched 4 words into the wood with something sharp. "She still comes back." I didn't go in. I slammed the door, wedged a dresser against it, and sat on my basement stairs shaking until my phone battery hit 20% from the flashlight running. I called Carol. She didn't pick up. I called the number on the real estate listing for my agent and got voicemail. By midnight, I'd convinced myself I needed to leave, pack a bag, get a hotel room, figure this out with an actual clear head instead of standing in my own basement at 11 p.m. reading threats scratched into support beams like some kind of proof of life note from a house that didn't want me in it. I was halfway up the stairs with my go bag when I heard the crawl space door open behind me. Not slam, not creak. Open. Slow, controlled. The sound of someone who knew exactly how much weight to put on a hinge to keep it quiet. I didn't turn around. I ran. I made it to my car in the driveway, hands shaking too hard to get the key in the ignition on the first try, and when I finally looked back at the house, every light I'd left on inside was off. Every single one. The whole house sat dark and silent against the desert night, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I drove to 80 and didn't sleep. In the morning, I called a locksmith, a security company, and finally, a woman named Patricia Henderson, the previous owner, whose number I found through an old utility bill still buried in a drawer in the kitchen. She picked up on the second ring, like she'd been waiting for someone to call for 6 years. "You bought the house," she said before I even gave my name. "I need to know what happened," I told her. "I found something in the crawl space." There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flat, the careful calm of someone who'd told this story enough times that the fear had worn down into exhaustion. "My husband's sister," she said. "Before us." She lived there almost 2 years without anyone in the neighborhood knowing. He built that space out for her, a real room, not just crawl space, further back than you'd think, past the beams. She had problems. He didn't want her institutionalized, thought he could handle it himself. A breath. "We didn't know until our daughter found her. She'd gotten out somehow. She used to come out at night, into the walls, into the vents. She knew that house better than we did." "Where is she now?" "They found her 2 counties over, 8 months after we moved out. She'd been living in somebody else's crawl space the whole time." Patricia's voice cracked, just slightly. "That's the part nobody tells you about houses like that one. Once somebody learns to live inside the walls, they don't really need doors anymore." I didn't go back for my thing. I called the security company from the motel and had them meet a locksmith at the property 2 days later, both of them going in ahead of me, and I stood on the front lawn while they cleared it, feeling stupid and terrified in equal measure. They found the crawl space exactly as I'd left it, dressers shoved against the door, exactly where I'd wedged it, except the dresser had been moved. 6 inches, maybe 8, just enough to prove someone had pushed against it from the other side and decided, for whatever reason, not to push any harder. I sold the house 4 months later, at a loss, to a cash buyer who didn't ask a single question about why a woman who'd lived there less than a month was suddenly desperate to leave. I don't know who lives there now. I don't drive past it. I don't look it up. But sometimes, late at night, in the new apartment I rent now with 3 deadbolts on the front door and nothing but a slab foundation underneath me, I still hear it. That same slow, deliberate scraping. Just for a second. Just long enough to remind me that some houses don't let go of what they were built to hide, and some things that learn to live in the walls never really learn how to leave. If tonight's stories kept you looking over your shoulder, subscribe to MrDeadSilence for more realistic horror every day. Until next time, stay safe and sleep with the lights on.